Introduction. In February 2021, a polar vortex slammed into Texas and knocked out the power grid for nearly 5 days. Millions of people sat in freezing homes. But something else was failing that week that barely made the news. Across the state, hundreds of thousands of vehicles would not start. Engines that had been sitting in sub-zero temperatures for days were grinding metal against metal the moment their owners turned the key. Tow trucks could not keep up. Repair shops were flooded for months afterward with cracked engine blocks, seized pistons, and destroyed bearings. Here is the part that made those repair bills so painful. The vast majority of that damage did not happen while the engine was running. It happened in the first few seconds after ignition. Those critical seconds when the oil is still sitting cold at the bottom of the pan and every moving part inside the engine is scraping against every other moving part with nothing in between. Engineers have a term for this. They call it cold start wear. And it is not unique to a Texas ice storm. It happens every single morning, in every driveway, in every climate. The widely cited engineering estimate is that somewhere between 50 and 75% of total engine wear accumulates during startup before the oil has fully circulated. Every time you turn the key, your engine ages more in those first few dry seconds than it does during the entire drive that follows. Welcome back to Historia Prime, the place where we dig through the ashes of history to find forgotten knowledge that can empower our everyday lives. Today, we are talking about the survival and longevity of the machines that keep our world moving. What if the single best defense against cold start wear was not a new synthetic oil formula, not a high-tech engine coating, but a compound first deployed by military engineers over 80 years ago? What if it costs roughly $2, bonds permanently to your engine metal, and provides lubrication from the very first moment of ignition, before the oil pump has even begun to push? The United States military has used it since World War II. NACA, the agency that became NASA, began researching it in 1946. It was integrated into the Apollo spacecraft. And today, one of Germany's most successful lubricant companies, Liqui Moly, was literally founded on it in 1957 and named after it. This is the story of molybdenum disulfide. Let us open the vault. Part 1. A mineral hiding in plain sight. The story of this compound begins long before any laboratory. Molybdenite, the mineral form of molybdenum disulfide, was used as a writing material and a lubricant for centuries. People confused it with graphite well into the 1700s because both are dark, slippery solids that leave marks on paper. It was not until the late 18th century that chemists finally identified molybdenite as a distinct substance. But here is the problem. In its raw, natural form, molybdenite is full of impurities that undermine its lubricating properties. The mineral was interesting, but not especially useful. That changed at the turn of the 20th century, when industrial chemists developed reliable methods of purifying molybdenum disulfide and extracting molybdenum metal. Suddenly, the compound could be produced to a high standard of purity, and researchers began to notice something remarkable about its physical behavior. The crystal structure of MOS2 is arranged in flat, hexagonal layers, like an infinite stack of microscopic playing cards pressed tightly together. Each layer consists of a sheet of molybdenum atoms sandwiched between two sheets of sulfur atoms. Within each layer, the bonds are strong, but between the layers, the bonds are weak. Scientists call these weak bonds van der Waals forces. What this means in practical terms is extraordinary. When pressure is applied, the layers do not crush or fracture. They glide against each other with almost no resistance at all. The coefficient of friction for MOS2 crystals sliding along their layers is approximately 0.025, one of the lowest values known for any material on Earth. That is not a chemical reaction doing the work, it is pure physical structure. And because MOS2 is a solid, It cannot be squeezed out the way a liquid lubricant can. Under extreme pressure, oil gets pushed aside. MOS2 stays exactly where it is. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, with high-purity MOS2 now available at industrial scale, researchers across Europe and the United States launched intensive investigations into its lubrication properties. The results were consistent. Under extreme pressure and in extreme temperatures, MOS2 outperformed every conventional lubricant available. And then the war made that research urgent. Part 2. From desert tanks to the surface of the moon. During World War II, the Allied military machine had a friction problem. Vehicles operating in North Africa were being chewed apart by the environment. Ultrafine desert sand infiltrated engines and gearboxes, destroying conventional oil lubrication faster than replacement parts could be shipped to the front. When lubrication fails in a tank engine in combat, people die. This was not an academic question. It was a survival crisis. Military engineers, drawing on the wave of MOS2 research from the late 1930s and 1940s, began incorporating the compound into maintenance protocols. The logic was simple. If the oil fails, if it burns off, if sand contaminates it, MOS2 bonded to the metal surfaces will still be there, providing a last line of defense. Military records document its adoption across multiple vehicle and aircraft programs through the end of the war. By 1945, MOS2-based lubricants had become standard issue in aircraft engine maintenance across the American military. Its emergency running properties meant that an engine treated with MOS2 could continue to operate for a limited time even after a complete loss of oil pressure, a feature that had obvious value for combat aircraft. But the story did not stop when the war ended. The most demanding engineering challenge in human history was just beginning. In 1946, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the agency that would become NASA, initiated formal research into aerospace applications of molybdenum disulfide. Jet engines were pushing into temperature and pressure ranges where conventional oil was simply useless. Internal components operating above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit under pressures that vaporize standard lubricants in seconds. NACA engineers tested numerous compounds. MOS2 consistently delivered the lowest friction and the longest wear life. And then came the final frontier. In the vacuum of outer space, liquid lubricants are worthless. They evaporate and outgas almost immediately. You need a solid lubricant that will not degrade in vacuum, that can handle extreme thermal swings from hundreds of degrees below zero to hundreds above, and that remains stable under radiation bombardment. MOS2 met every one of those requirements. It was integrated into the mechanical systems of the Mercury space capsule. It was applied to the extendable legs of the Apollo lunar module. Let that land for a moment. The legs that touched the surface of the moon were lubricated with the same compound you can order online today for a few dollars. So here is the question worth asking. If this material was trusted to protect engines in the Sahara Desert, jet turbines at max speed, and spacecraft on the way to the moon, why is it virtually unknown to the average car owner? Part 3. The invisible war inside your engine. To understand why MOS2 matters for your car, you need to understand what is actually happening inside your engine every time you drive. When you look at a polished engine component with your naked eye, it looks perfectly smooth, but under an electron microscope, that surface looks like a jagged mountain range. Engineers call these microscopic peaks and valleys asperities. Every metal surface has them, no matter how carefully it has been machined. When your engine is running at operating temperature, motor oil does a reasonable job of keeping these microscopic mountains apart. It creates a fluid film between the surfaces, and as long as that film holds, metal never touches metal. Modern full synthetic oils are genuinely excellent at this. That is important to acknowledge. The oil in your engine right now is a far more sophisticated product than anything available in the 1940s or 1960s. But here is where even the best oil has a structural weakness. Oil is a liquid, and liquids obey gravity. When you park your car for the night, the oil drains off the cylinder walls, out of the bearing surfaces, and settles into the oil pan at the bottom of the engine. By morning, the upper engine is essentially dry. When you turn the key, the oil pump starts pushing oil back up through the galleries, but there is a delay. For the first few seconds, the critical wear surfaces are running with minimal or no lubrication. On a cold morning, when the oil is thick and flows even more slowly, that delay gets longer. This is cold start wear, and it adds up over the life of an engine. Thousands of startups, each one grinding away a little more material from the cylinder walls, the cam lobes, the crankshaft bearings. MOS2 addresses this specific vulnerability in a way that liquid oil physically cannot. When MOS2 particles are introduced into the oil system, they are carried by the oil into the friction zones. Under the heat and pressure of engine operation, the particles undergo a process called burnishing. They compress into the microscopic valleys of the metal surface and bond there. The result is a thin, solid film that does not drain away when the engine is turned off. When you start your car the next morning, that film is still in place. There is no dry start. The lubrication is already on the surface, providing protection from the very first revolution of the crankshaft before the oil pump has even built pressure. That is not a marketing claim. That is the fundamental physics of how solid film lubricants work, and it is the reason military and aerospace engineers chose MOS2 for applications where failure was not an option. Part 4. Why your mechanic never mentioned it. Now, if you have been paying attention, you are probably asking the obvious question. If this compound is this effective, and it has been known for over 80 years, and it is validated by the military and NASA, why is it not in every engine on Earth? The honest answer is not a conspiracy. It is economics. To be fair, let us start with the legitimate technical reasons for caution. Modern engines are precision instruments designed around specific oil formulations. Automakers spend millions testing and certifying particular oil specifications for their vehicles. Adding any aftermarket product introduces a variable that was not part of the original engineering validation. That is a real concern, not an invented one. Manufacturers have valid reasons for saying, "Stick with what we tested." There is also the fact that modern full synthetic oils already contain sophisticated anti-wear additive packages, including compounds like ZDDP, zinc dialkyl dithiophosphate, that form their own protective films on metal surfaces. The gap between a well-maintained modern engine running quality synthetic oil and that same engine with MOS2 added is narrower than the gap was in the 1940s, when MOS2 was compared against crude petroleum lubricants. Context matters, but here is where the economic story gets genuinely interesting, and it does not require any conspiracy theory to explain. You cannot patent a naturally occurring mineral. That is a fundamental fact of patent law. And without a patent, no company has an exclusive financial incentive to spend tens of millions of dollars on clinical-grade automotive testing, OEM certification lobbying, and mass-market advertising for MOS2. The compound works, but nobody owns it, so nobody is motivated to champion it through the expensive regulatory and marketing pipeline that puts a product on the shelf at AutoZone. Compare that to proprietary synthetic oil formulations. Every major oil company has patented blends, trademarked product lines, and massive advertising budgets built around convincing you that their specific bottle is the one your engine needs. They make recurring revenue every 3 to 6 months when you come back for another oil change. The entire business model depends on you consuming oil regularly. MOS2 disrupts that model in an uncomfortable way. A compound that bonds semi-permanently to the metal surface that does not need to be reapplied every few thousand miles, that is unpatentable and costs almost nothing, is simply not a product that any major corporation can build a profitable recurring revenue business around. So what happened is not suppression, it is neglect. MOS2 was never banned or hidden. It just never had a corporate champion with the money and motivation to push it into the consumer mainstream. It sat in military maintenance manuals, in NASA technical reports, in industrial supply catalogs, while the consumer auto world built its entire infrastructure around products that need to be repurchased. There is one notable exception. In 1957, a man named Hans Henle in Ulm, Germany, acquired the patent for an MOS2 oil additive formulation and founded a company around it. He named that company Liqui Moly. Liqui for the liquid additive, Moly for the molybdenum disulfide. Today, Liqui Moly is one of Germany's leading lubricant brands, with over 4,000 products sold in more than 150 countries. Their original MOS2 oil additive, the one the entire company was named after, is still in production more than 65 years later. That is the quiet proof. A multi-billion euro company was literally built on this compound. It was never a secret. It was just never marketed to you. Part 5. How to protect your engine today. History only matters if you can apply it. So here is the practical knowledge, delivered honestly with the caveats you deserve. MOS2 as an engine additive is available in two common forms. You can purchase pre-mixed liquid suspensions from established brands like Liquimoly, which have already calibrated the particle size and concentration for automotive use. Or you can source molybdenum disulfide powder from industrial suppliers and add it to your oil yourself. If you go the powder route, particle size is critical. Standard automotive oil filters capture contaminants in the 10 to 20 micron range. If you use cheap, coarsely milled industrial powder, the particles may be large enough to get trapped in your oil filter, which defeats the entire purpose. You need sub-micron MOS2 powder, specifically in the 0.2 to 1.0 micron range. Particles this fine remain suspended in the oil and pass through the filter to reach the friction surfaces where they can do their work. For a standard passenger car engine, a pre-mixed additive like Liquimoly's MOS2 product is the simplest approach. Follow the dosage instructions on the bottle. If using fine powder, approximately 2 tablespoons is the commonly cited amount for a typical engine oil volume. The application process is straightforward. Add the compound through the oil filler cap, ideally during a fresh oil change so the tribofilm forms in a clean environment. Start the engine and let it idle for about 15 minutes to reach operating temperature and allow the oil to distribute the MOS2 particles throughout the system. Then drive the vehicle normally for the next 50 miles or so. During this period, the combination of heat, pressure, and mechanical stress will burnish the MOS2 into the metal surfaces, forming the protective solid film. After that initial break-in period, the film is established. It does not wash away with oil changes. It is a physical bond to the metal substrate. Now, the honest caveats. MOS2 is not magic. It will not resurrect an engine that is already severely damaged. If your piston rings are shot or your bearings are worn through, this compound can slow further deterioration, but it cannot reverse structural damage that has already occurred. The real power of MOS2 is preventive. It is about applying protection before the damage accumulates. If you ride a motorcycle with a wet clutch system, where the engine oil also lubricates the transmission clutch plates, exercise caution. MOS2 is so effective at reducing friction that it can cause wet clutch plates to slip, preventing them from gripping properly. This is a well-documented limitation, not a minor footnote, and a broader caveat about aftermarket additives in general. If your vehicle is under warranty, adding any product not specified by the manufacturer could technically give the dealer grounds to question a warranty claim. That is not a MOS2 specific issue. It is a general reality of how automotive warranties work. For newer vehicles under warranty, using a manufacturer-approved oil that already contains molybdenum-based friction modifiers, as many premium synthetics now do, may be the wiser path. For older vehicles, high-mileage vehicles, or any engine outside of warranty, the risk-reward calculation shifts significantly in MOS2's favor. Conclusion. Let us go back to where we started. Texas, February 2021. Millions of engines sitting in freezing temperatures for days, then grinding themselves apart the moment they were started. For the engines in that crisis that happened to have MOS2 bonded to their metal surfaces, the story was different. When the oil was cold and slow, when the pump was struggling to push viscous fluid through frozen galleries, there was still a solid film on the cylinder walls, on the cam lobes, on the bearings. There was no dry start. The protection was already there. That is not a hypothetical. That is what solid film lubrication does. It is why the military chose it for desert warfare and why NASA chose it for space. It performs precisely when conventional lubrication cannot. The compound that took humanity to the moon, that protected tank engines in the Sahara, that became the foundation of a billion-euro German company, is available to you right now for the cost of a cup of coffee. It was never truly hidden. It was never banned. It was simply left out of the conversation because no one could build a monopoly on a mineral that belongs to the earth. But you know its name now, and knowledge, once gained, is its own kind of armor. If this vault changed how you think about the machines in your life, subscribe to Historia Prime and share this with someone who deserves to know. The best defense for your engine is not expensive, it is informed. Stay curious, stay self-reliant, and we will see you in the next vault.